A warm welcome to everybody to this annual Jan and Mildred Memorial Lecture. My name is Claire Lefort, and I'm the director of the wonderful Parks Institute for the study of Jewish and non-Jewish relations, one of the jewels of the crown in the University of Southampton. Since the donation by James Parks of his library to the University of Southampton in 1964, the center has grown into a major institute recognized as such by the university in 2000. And it has made a contribution to the research and public knowledge about Jewish, non-Jewish relations locally, nationally, and globally. We are a vibrant community of scholars, of archivists, librarians. We publish 3 journals, and we are also home to a thriving community of undergraduate and postgraduate students working in a wide range of fields in Jewish and non-Jewish relations. The success of the Parks Institute reflects not only the commitment of its dedicated staff and the wider support of the University of Southampton, but also partnerships with a wide range of organizations outside Southampton. And at the forefront has been the Ian Karten Charitable Trust, founded by the former refugee from Nazism. Ian Karten met James Parks at a garden party in James Parks' home in Cambridgeshire. He was a young refugee then, and he had been able to come to Britain in the late 30s on a studentship at what became part of the University of London. And Ian was not only impressed by the chance to see what became the Parks Library, but also by the generosity and the kindness of James Parks at putting him at ease in an alien environment. And this was really part of James Parks' wider work in helping refugees, especially young students and academics, escape from persecution. So after a remarkable and successful career in engineering, Ian devoted with his wife, Mildred, his life in retirement, creating a trust to help those like himself who needed extra support through education to develop their careers. Since then, the Karten Trust has supported thousands of students. It has set up hundreds of centers in Britain and Israel to help physically disabled people develop themselves through the use of technology. And here at the University of Southampton, Ian Karten's generosity began with support for MA students on our Jewish History and Culture program. It then extended to support a postdoctoral fellowship, first occupied by Sarah Pierce, who is now the Karten Professor in the Study of Jews in Antiquity and who is currently the head of Humanities. And that support and generosity expanded even further. So we have 2 other lectureships that have been created, and the Karten Trust has continued to support outreach. And indeed, all of our outreach work in schools, in colleges, in adult education were at the core of Ian's interests. And we are really delighted that through the Trust generosity, we are able to reach such a wide audience. Most recently, the Trust has also supported our shift to cultural and digital activities, and we have been able to recruit a digital coordinator, Katie Power, who is supporting us tonight. The support given by the Karten Trust is now over £2 million. In 1998, in honor of his remarkable career and generosity, the university awarded Ian Karten an honorary doctorate, which was one of the most moving events in the university's history. Sadly, we have lost both Ian and Mildred Karten, and as a way of remembering 2 outstanding individuals, we are holding the annual Ian and Mildred Karten Memorial Lecture. And our speaker tonight is particularly dear to us and fitting actually to deliver the Karten lecture for 2 reasons. Natan Meir, as some of my colleagues in history and in Parks will remember, was the first holder of the position in East European Jewish history and culture. He is now a professor of Judaic studies in the Harold Schnitzer Family Program at Portland State University, But when he was a lecturer here, he created really solid foundations for the development of Eastern European Jewish history. And as her successor, I'm very grateful for what he's done, and I'm delighted to welcome him back, albeit virtually, to Parks and History for one night. I would also take this opportunity to share, to talk a little bit about Ukraine and to share the Parks Institute shock at what is happening. And I want to express all our solidarity and friendship to the Ukrainian people who are unjustly attacked and now who are either under Russian bombs or grieving their loved ones on the routes of a forced exile. So we stand with Ukrainians and also with the Belarusian population that is opposing this war. And Natan knows Ukraine very well. His first groundbreaking work, a book, was on Kiev, Kiev Jewish Metropolis, a History, 1859-1914. And as he has demonstrated in this first book and in the new one, which is called Stepchildren of the Städter, the Destitute, Disabled, and Mad of Jewish Eastern Europe, he is a truly interdisciplinary scholar, combining social, cultural, and religious history of Eastern European Jewry. The topic he has chosen for tonight's talk, Town Fools, Madmen, and Possessed Women, the Mentally Ill in Jewish Eastern Europe, is particularly fitting for the Karten lecture, given the Karten Foundation interests and generous support to disabled people. So Natan, very many thanks for agreeing to give the Karten lecture tonight, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Claire. It's so nice to be with all of you. Yes, albeit virtually, as Claire said, but I have extremely fond memories of my years in Southampton. I see familiar names and familiar faces here. And it was actually, I want to offer a particular thanks to both Tony Kushner and to Mark Cornwall, who both were mentors to me during my time at Southampton when I was a junior scholar, and really provided me with some very sound advice and the support that I needed at that time to move forward with my research and to complete the publication of my book on Kiev and to move forward with the new research project, which then ultimately turned into to Stepchildren of the Shtetl. And I also remember meeting the Kartens at one event that we had at Parks, must have been 2004, 2005. And they really were lovely people and incredibly generous. And I was amazed to see, and not amazed, but it was striking to me that they did have this interest also in supporting disabled people. And when I saw that, Claire and I decided that this was the right topic to offer for the Karten Memorial Lecture. So I'm hoping that you can see my screen now. This is the cover of the book, which Claire mentioned, Stepchildren of the Shtetl, the Destitute, Disabled, and Mad of Jewish Eastern Europe, 1800 to 1939. And as you can tell from the title, what I'm talking about this evening is really just one aspect of this project. Sorry, I was just going to start a timer here so that I stuck to time, because Claire and I agreed there would be I would talk for a specific period, which is good. It's always good to be limited in your time and to know, because we want to have a good discussion period as well. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the larger context that I'm talking about, the Jews of Eastern Europe were for centuries one of the largest Jewish communities. Well, actually, I misspoke. The largest Jewish community in the world from the 17th to the 20th centuries. And very briefly, the geopolitical context that we're talking about tonight are in the early modern period, which I'm not going to spend much time on. We're talking about the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And after the partitions of Poland, after Poland was broken up by the large empires of the day in Eastern and Central Europe, most of those East European Jews fell under either Russian or Austrian rule. And you can see here on the upper map, the territory of the Pale of Settlement, which was essentially the western provinces of the Russian Empire where Jews were permitted to live. And over here, the Kingdom of Poland, which was a kind of a rump Polish state that officially had some autonomy, but was actually under Russian rule. And this area, which is not clearly marked on the map in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was called Galicia. Those are the southern provinces of Poland. In the interwar period, after World War I discuss in the book, for the most part, the Jews of independent Poland, the Second Polish Republic, between World War I and World War II. So this was a very, very large Jewish population. By the end of the 19th century, we're talking about somewhere between 5 and 6 million Jews. And that was after already the beginnings of a large migration out of the Russian Empire. Jews played a very important economic role in this part of the world, but were often perceived in very negative terms because of popular anti-Semitism and because of anti-Semitism on the official level among Russian bureaucrats. If we look inwards, Jewish culture in Eastern Europe was a very, very dynamic, very rich. Some scholars use the term self-confident culture. In terms of religion and literature and language, there's a lot, of course, to be said about this culture, which we don't have time to go into tonight. Of course, mostly a traditionally pious and Yiddish-speaking community. Even in the mid to late 19th century, when modernity began to make inroads into the East European Jewish community, we still only have small pockets who begin to acculturate, who begin to speak Russian or Polish and teach it to their children, and who begin to want exposure to the Western and the secular world. For the most part, this remains a very traditional community, and we'll actually have opportunity to talk about that specifically a little bit later. So just a couple words on the goals of this project. When I set out to do this project, and I have a very, very clear memory of myself sitting in the library, the Southampton University Library, in the Jewish collections area, beginning work on this project. I wanted to, of course, in some way, recover the experience of the outcasts of the Jewish community. At that time, I wasn't quite sure exactly which categories this involved. Obviously, at some point along the way, it became clearer to me that I was talking about disabled people, people with physical and cognitive disabilities. I was talking about paupers and beggars, and also poor orphans to some extent. And as I'm hoping to share with you tonight, I was to a very limited extent able to recover their experiences. For the most part, it was disappointing, as you can imagine, because most of these people were illiterate, and the surrounding society generally did not really care very much about their stories and about recording their stories. I wanted to understand the role that these outcasts played symbolically in the Jewish community. And then in a larger sense, I wanted to, through this project, get a better grasp on East European Jewish society as a whole, which I had begun to explore, of course, in my first book on the Jewish community of Kiev. So since our topic tonight is mental illness, And of course, people who were mentally ill in the period that we're talking about were usually called mad, or whatever the equivalent would be in the relevant language. In the Middle Ages, among both Christians and Jews, madness might be viewed as an illness. It was sometimes seen as the product of demonic powers, of witchcraft. And of course, there were religious remedies for that among both Christians and Jews. So both of those religious groups knew of this remedy called exorcism. And sometimes, and of course, these three can overlap in some ways. Sometimes it was understood as a punishment from God. But up until the modern period, and of course, this is generalizing and oversimplifying in some ways, but it's pretty safe to say that overall they are somehow or other integrated into society, which is to say that there's no concept of an insane asylum in the pre-modern period. There is no separate place to segregate madmen and madwomen unless they are violent and dangerous to other people, and then of course they're imprisoned in some way. It's interesting to point out that in Christianity, and especially this concept developed in particular in Russian Orthodoxy, there was a concept of the holy fool, which generally Judaism did not have. And this was a concept based, according to some, on 1 Corinthians chapter 4, we are fools for Christ's sake. The holy fool generally displayed a kind of shocking, unconventional behavior. It's unclear whether sometimes the madness might have been real, sometimes it's feigned. Very, very interesting concept in the history of Christianity. As I mentioned, not anywhere near as prevalent in Judaism, especially because Judaism, with its emphasis on study as a pathway to holiness, really valued rationality above all else, because you had to be able to be in your right mind, of course, to be able to study the holy texts. And so madness was generally not seen as anything positive, often attributed to spirits and demons, which had a very, very real presence in Judaism until relatively recently. But there is also a sense in which, even in Judaism, madness might have something special about it, that the mad might have some sort of powers that ordinary people do not have, the powers of clairvoyance, of prophecy, of being able to see certain elements of the supernatural or of the divine in the ordinary world that most people can't see. And you even perceive this idea in a Yiddish aphorism that was quite common in the 19th century. A ganzer nar is a halber novi, a whole fool is half a prophet. So there's, even within folk wisdom, there is this possibility that the fool or the madman might actually be uttering some words of truth. Now, in the Russian Empire, the mad were usually cared for by the Russian Orthodox Church up until about the late 1700s. And what this meant is that sometimes certain churches or monasteries would have a shack or a hovel of some kind set aside for mentally ill people who could find some sort of shelter there, and then they would be cared for in some kind of minimal way by churchmen. The state first steps in, this is the Russian state, in the late 18th century with some kind of very, very primitive insane asylums in an attempt to segregate the mad from the rest of society. And across Europe in the 19th century, we see more and more the medicalization of mental illness. Madness begins to be perceived as an illness of the mind. And that brings, as it did to many other countries, the psychiatric hospital to the Russian Empire. But generally, they were so horrific across Russia. And unfortunately, things haven't changed all that much. But I think these early hospitals were particularly horrible. And so people tended to try to avoid them as much as they could. When Jewish hospitals began to be established in the Russian Empire, right around the middle of the 19th century, some of them did actually have psychiatric wards. But they were, I think, only 3 or 4 hospitals. If we're looking, for example, late 19th or early 20th century, only 3 or 4 of the hospitals actually had such wards. They had very limited space. And most mentally ill people in the Jewish community are cared for by their families, or in some cases, if they don't have family members who are willing to care for them, they end up in the hekdesh, in the poorhouse. The hekdesh is another ubiquitous institution in the Jewish community that I discuss to a great extent in the book. I'm not talking about it much this evening, but to the extent to which it actually also served as a shelter for mentally ill people, it's important that we mention it tonight as well. And in some cases, we actually have documents from the archives, which are petitions from Jews to the authorities that they hospitalize family members for mental illness. This was the protocol in the Russian Empire, that anyone, any subject of the Russian Empire could submit a petition to the Russian authorities if they felt that a family member of theirs needed to be hospitalized, usually if they were presenting a harm or the threat of harm to other people in the community. You can see here on the screen a few additional Yiddish aphorisms about mad people or fools. Someone else's fool is a source of laughter, but one's own fool is an embarrassment. So very often the fact of having someone in the family with mental illness was seen as a source of shame. Mitanar is an ebiger tsar, a fool brings constant woe, and a fool is an evil decree from heaven. So, not very surprisingly, we have these quite negative attitudes towards mental illness in the Jewish community. I think that's not very much different from the attitudes that we would find among Christians as well, and probably throughout Europe we'd find similar approaches. I think, safe to say. So one of the things that I want to do with you tonight is to present some evidence from a particular archival source base. These are the Gutmacher Kvitlach. A kvittel is a petition that was submitted by an ordinary Jewish man or Jewish woman to a rabbi in usually in Eastern Europe. Very often, kvitlach were sent to Hasidic rabbis, but in this case, we have the petitions that were sent to Rabbi Eliyahu Gutmacher, who himself was not a Hasidic rabbi. He did not belong to the pietistic branch of Judaism that emerged in the late 19th century as a kind of Jewish revival movement known as Hasidism, and that flourished in Eastern Europe in the 19th century. But he functioned in some ways as kind of a quasi-Hasidic Rebbe, especially insofar as he was known as a wonder worker. He was known as a miracle worker. And so really in a kind of miraculous way, I didn't actually plan to say miraculous way there. He was a miracle worker, and I was going to say his archive was preserved in a miraculous way. I never quite thought of that coincidence before. Of course, historians don't really believe in miracles, so it wasn't really a miracle. It wasn't really a miracle that his archive was saved, but and the story of it is a long one that I can go into in the question and answer period if you want to. But thousands of the kvitlach that were sent to him over the period of probably around a decade managed to be preserved and ultimately ended up in two different collections, one of them in New York at the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research and one of them at the National Library of Israel. And this is an example of the what the kvittles looked like. They're mostly written in Hebrew, although the people who sent them to Guttmacher usually did not know Hebrew themselves, so they had to have them translated from Yiddish into Hebrew. But Hebrew was considered to be the appropriate language to submit your petition in because this was a holy rabbi, and you wanted to make sure that the language you sent your request in was appropriate, was a fitting language for, let's say, the realm of religion, and that, of course, would be the Hebrew language. And people ask for all kinds of things. They ask for advice, they ask for blessings, and they reveal their deepest problems in these kvitlach. They reveal problems having to do with marital issues, with business problems, all kinds of health problems, including mental illness. And so they're really a wonderful window into the ordinary concerns of Eastern European Jews in the 1870s, which is when we think, although they're not dated, we think that that's approximately when they were sent to Guttmacher. So I want to present to you a few examples of the kvittles about mental illness. These are mostly paraphrases that I did when I was going through the kvittles. I didn't tend to translate them word for word, although I tried to write down the most important elements of the wording, as you can imagine. So kvittel number one, we have a petition from the town of Zolshin in Yiddish, or Jałoshin in Polish, from a man by the name of Yankov Shlomo HaKohen ben Golda. He asked for healing for his daughter, Riva Rezel Bas Gittel, for insanity. And the Hebrew term that he used was bilbul hada'at. Actually, as I mentioned, it probably wasn't the Hebrew term that he used. It was probably the term that was chosen by the person who he paid to write the petition in Hebrew for him. So we can't really be sure what the original Yiddish was that he used, but bilbul hada'at basically means a kind of confusion of the mind. Please pray for my daughter who was orphaned of her mother. She has been mad for 3 months now. Nitbalbela b'sichla. Again, a kind of confusion. And I don't know what the cause is, and the expert doctors also cannot find a cure. So this is interesting for us as historians looking at this document, because we know that he has gone to doctors already. And it seems in this case that perhaps he has actually consulted with doctors before coming to Guttmacher for a cure. And I mentioned to you earlier, this is the Jews of Eastern Europe in the late 19th century are still generally quite a traditionally pious population, but modernity has been making inroads, and many people are, of course, aware of modern medicine. By this time, there have been Jewish hospitals functioning in the main cities for at least a decade, sometimes more than 1 decade, sometimes 2 or 3. And so you can see here that he has already gone to the expert doctors. In the second one that we find from this same man, he again asks for healing for his daughter, Riva Rezel. And he asks again for help in this matter. He says, I received an amulet from your holiness the first time, but it has not yet helped. And so we now understand, although in general, the archive that I mentioned to you contains almost no responses, right? We don't have any of the actual letters that Guttmacher wrote back to people. We only have their requests. But in certain cases, we have a second request, which mentions the the remedy that the rabbi had sent. And in this case, it was an amulet, most probably some kind of Kabbalistic mystical amulet with various names of God, which was a tried and true remedy among Jews in Eastern Europe to heal various kinds of illnesses. But he says it hasn't helped. And so now he asks him, what should I do? Should I come to visit you personally rather than send you a letter? Maybe coming to your presence will actually be more effective. Or perhaps you think I should go to the doctors in Warsaw or Breslau or Berlin. So it seems that in this case, he probably went to see a doctor who was close to his hometown of Zolshin. And now he's asking Guttmacher, well, maybe I should go to a doctor in a big city, like in Warsaw or in Germany, right? The cities of Breslau, which is today Wrocław in Western Poland, or Berlin. And again, here we have this interesting insight into the kind of internal thinking of someone who is presumably quite a pious Jew. He obviously believes in the healing power of a rabbi like Guttmacher, but he's also not 100% sure that that the religious solution is the only one, because he is obviously also mooting the possibility of seeking further medical treatment. And he even asks Guttmacher, what do you think? Should I continue to rely on religion, or should I go the path of science? And I think it's fair to say that many Jews at that time would have tried to do whatever they thought might be effective. And if it meant writing a letter to someone like Guttmacher and also going to a doctor, they probably would have done both. Here's another kvittel from the town of Dobrynsky or Dobrzyn in Polish, from Fegelcha Bas Leah. So this is from a woman. I'm going to skip the first part, which is biographical details that are not relevant to our discussion. And she asked for healing for her son Avram Yitzchak, who previously was sensible as any person, and then suddenly was struck with epilepsy and became lame in one leg and an idiot. Obviously, we would not use that term today, but that I tried to translate it to the term that would have been used at the time. And he is rebellious. What's really complicated about these documents is very often the Hebrew that's used to describe certain aspects of behavior is an archaic Hebrew that really comes originally from the biblical layer of Hebrew, and then sometimes from Talmudic or from medieval layers of Hebrew. And in some cases, there was a very standard usage in medical terminology at the time. So we know that choli nichpa generally meant epilepsy, or whatever the symptoms of epilepsy that we would be familiar with today. And in other words, some kind of seizures. But then we have this term, behu sorer umoreh, that's the last term on here, which is taken directly from the Bible, from the Hebrew Bible, and he is rebellious. He is a rebellious son. So what that means in terms of mental illness and what kind of diagnosis he would receive today is very hard to ascertain. It's something that obviously we can only really speculate about without having any further information on a case like this one. Few more examples from the Kvitlach. A kvittel from Opochno, a boy by the name of Yankiv or Mendel Yankiv. As you could tell from the illustration that I showed to you, the reproduction, the Kvitlach are of course written by hand, sometimes in beautiful hand, and sometimes it's more difficult to read. The person wrote, sometimes he is like a regular person, and other times an evil spirit enters into him, and then he cannot bless or pray or lay tefillin. In other words, he can't wrap his body with the phylacteries, with the prayer boxes and straps that Jewish men would ordinarily pray with on weekday mornings. And here you can see, of course, that it's a very traditional perspective on this kind of phenomenon. The evil spirit enters into him, and there's no talk at all about an illness or about seeking doctors. This is a much more, I would say, medieval understanding of mental illness. The Kvittel from Juromin, from Shraga Feivel Ben Gittel Halevi, a storekeeper, who has a son, Tzvi Chaim Ben Hinda, who is handicapped or disabled, cannot eat by himself. He is an idiot and must be fed slowly. And his wife, who is his second wife, who he really just married a few months ago, cannot bear the heavy burden of caring for his son. So we get a glimpse into the family dynamics of what happens when one of the children is disabled. In this case, we have a stepmother who is finding it very, very difficult to care for this son. Of course, what happens next, we don't know. And a kvittel from a town called Berzin, from Moshe Zindel ben Miriam, who asked for healing for his daughter Bluma, who was engaged. And he says, for 5 weeks now, an evil spirit has emerged within her. She cannot sleep at night. She cries, sometimes plays with and breaks her fingers. And she claps her palms together until blood runs from her fingers. And sometimes she is silent for 2 hours and says nothing. The time for the wedding has come, and the groom will tear up the tanoim. The groom will tear up the engagement contract that the two families had already signed. And of course, he asks, as you can imagine, he asks Guttmacher to pray for her so that she may marry, because this was very, very, this was crucial in the Jewish society at the time. What almost all of these people to a family, to a person, asked for their children was for boys to be able to study Torah, and also secondarily to make a living, and for girls, for young women to be able to marry. That was the pattern, the sociological pattern, and that was what people wanted. In this case, of course, the pattern is disrupted. Now, one possibility, of course, in terms of explaining this evil spirit in his daughter Bluma, is that she was very reluctant to be married in this case. Right? We have studies from other periods in Jewish history when spirits like a dibuk, a reincarnated spirit or a wandering spirit, would enter into a young woman who was engaged to be married. And we have pretty good evidence that in these cases, not that it was a conscious decision by this young woman, but there's something psychological going on. And the only way that she can get out of this marriage, which she doesn't want to enter into, may be to enter into this state of madness. That may be what's going on here. Obviously, we don't know for sure. So the Kvitlach are really remarkable in that they give us some sort of window. And this is what I mentioned earlier on at the introduction to my talk, when I was saying that I had hoped to get some insight into the lives of these outcasts of Jewish society. Of course, in this case, we don't actually have their own voices. We have their relatives who are describing the situation, but it's as close as we can get. Another aspect of mental illness in East European Jewish society is quite a curious one. And this is the figure of the town fool, who is pretty much ubiquitous throughout Eastern Europe. Almost any memoir of East European Jewish society that you read, or any memorial volume that you look at, by memorial volume, I mean the Yisker books, the memorial volumes that were compiled after the Holocaust to bring some sort of living memory to communities that had been destroyed by describing them in great detail. And you often find in these sources some reference to the town fool, who seemingly was in every single shtetl, every single Jewish town in Eastern Europe. And the person might be someone who's described as an idiot, right? Of course, as I mentioned, we don't use this term anymore, but if we were to talk about that person today, we might say they had some sort of developmental disability, cognitive disability, or maybe they were described as a madman or a madwoman. Very, very sociologically and anthropologically interesting, but obviously also very problematic, because they are sometimes yes, it's true, sometimes cared for by the community, but also often a figure of fun. They're described as having been teased mercilessly by, usually by the boys in town. And in some cases, we even hear of these people. I'm thinking of one in particular where a woman freezes to death on a cold winter night because she had nowhere to shelter for that night. Very, very, very difficult historical material we're dealing with. As I mentioned earlier, there was a thread of Jewish belief which saw people with mental illness, people who were perceived as mad, as having some sort of special connection to the divine, special connection to prophecy. And in some cases, we actually hear descriptions of the town fool along those lines. And we know, for example, that in the city of Vilna, today, Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania, but in the 19th century, a very, very important Jewish center, there were several figures, several varieties of town fool who basically lived in the center of the Jewish neighborhood. One of them you can see here, we actually have a photograph of on the left, Gedalka the Cantor, he was known as. This is from a photo montage that was created by the avant-garde photographer Moshe Vorobeichik, who was also known as Meir. Later on was active in Paris. And he created this montage of this particular figure, Gedalka the Cantor, in a book about Jewish Vilna, which is a very, very avant-garde book for the time. And there was interest, not only on the part of artists like Vorobeichik in these kinds of figures, but there was also interest on the part of journalists, and sometimes for pure prurient reasons, we might say. So there was a rotating feature in the Forward or the Vorwärts Yiddish newspaper in New York. That was basically the rotogravure. That was the very common feature in newspapers of the day. I'm talking here about the 1920s, 1930s, utilizing the very exciting technologies of the day, the photographic technologies, to bring to people who had left East European Jewry society as immigrants, to bring back to them aspects of that world. And often it was kind of almost a freak show taste to this rotogravure page. And so they would have kind of interesting people or interesting types from Eastern Europe. And sometimes you would have, as you can see from these photographs here, you would have pictures of these town fools who were considered kind of curiosities, and certainly good for business if you were looking to make sure that the circulation of your newspaper was as robust as possible. You wanted to make sure that you had interesting things for people to see in the newspaper when they turned to that rotogravure section with basically it was just full of photographs, right? The entire newspaper page was just large-scale photographs with captions. Now, aside from the individual town fools that I mentioned, who showed up usually as just one or two people in a given town or a given city, there were experts who in the early 20th century began to talk about mental health as a particularly Jewish problem, not from the point of view of, let's say, human interest, curiosity, but as a abiding social concern that Jews needed to think about very carefully. And part of this was because there was a perception at the time, early 20th century, both among Jews and non-Jews, that the East European Jews were more susceptible to mental illness. And usually they would talk specifically about some kind of nervous condition that East European Jews were prone to, because usually it was described, it was explained as because of the persecution that they faced in Eastern Europe, because so many of them were so terribly poor, because the vast majority of Jews in Russia and Poland at this time are of course, very, very poor, really destitute, which was part of the reason for the huge emigration from Eastern Europe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries to, for the most part, to North America, but also, of course, to other parts of Europe, including the UK. And there seemed to be a growing mental health crisis among Jews at the time. Here, I'm focusing specifically on Poland and on Warsaw, because we have good documentation for Warsaw from this period, from the very early years of the 20th century and into the interwar period, into the 1920s and 1930s. There were newspaper reports at the time in Jewish newspapers that talked about hordes of crazy people who, Jews obviously, who had kind of inundated the city, and either their relatives had sent them there or they had been abandoned in some way. There were not enough beds to care for these people at the Jewish hospitals, and there was a sense of desperation at the time. And of course, as you can imagine, on the part of Jews, especially Jews who were more integrated, who were more acculturated into Polish culture, there was a fear that the larger Polish Christian society would perceive these mentally ill Jews as kind of representative of the Jewish community as a whole, which, as you can imagine, they didn't want. And so, to some degree, there's a sense among, again, both among Jews and non-Jews, that there is a potential for mental illness among the East European Jewish population. I wouldn't call it there was any kind of panic, but the concerns were certainly being raised. One of the most prominent activists in this field, as you can see here, Dr. Adam Wiesel, who was the founder of an organization right around 1906, 1907, that was called the Jewish Organization for the Indigent, Nervous, and Mentally Ill. Of course, you can see from the name of the organization that things had gotten to such a state that some felt that it was important to have a specific voluntary organization established for this purpose. And this society, which existed into the interwar period, ultimately established an asylum, essentially, in a town called Otwock, which was a suburb of Poland that was known for its many sanatoria. And this hospital or asylum for the Jewish mentally ill functioned all the way up to the outbreak of World War II. And although obviously it was limited in the number of people it could take in, did function as a relief valve for the Jewish hospitals, such as the Warsaw Jewish hospitals, which only had so much space for mentally ill people. And as you can see here, the third bullet point on this slide, that the psychiatric ward had originally been built for 100 patients, and by 1906, it held 150 people, and the demand was much greater even than that. And we certainly have reports that in some cases, families placed their loved ones at Christian hospitals, which Jews were normally reluctant to do because they could not receive kosher food there, and because they were worried they would be proselytized to. But in some cases, they felt that they simply had no choice but to place them in a Christian hospital as well. I'm going to close with a photograph that I took of the former Jewish psychiatric hospital in Otwock. I took a group here a few years ago. I lead Jewish heritage tours through Eastern Europe, and I put on the itinerary this particular place, both because I wanted to see it, and I thought it would be interesting for the participants in my tour. As you can see, it's abandoned. It continued to be used. Well, I should say first that the residents of the hospital were, of course, murdered by the Nazis during World War II. It continued to be used as a psychiatric hospital in the communist period, and then was abandoned, I think, at some point in the 1980s or 1990s. And since then, as you can see, it's become dilapidated, and you can even find on YouTube videos that people have made of this place at night. As you can imagine, there are local legends about it being haunted, which have a particular strength because of the former Jewish character of the institution. But I think it's, in some ways, I don't know if it's a fitting tribute, but it's certainly a very poignant and haunting memorial and monument to the period that we've been talking about, to I think the heroic efforts of people like Adam Wiesel to try to bring treatment to Jews who were mentally ill, to replace the I would say primitive approaches to mental illness that had existed beforehand with a much more humane approach. And an example of that particular humanity we can find in the psychiatric hospital that used to exist within the walls that you can see here. So I'm gonna stop here and thank you for your attention, and look forward very much to your questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So we'll give you a virtual round of applause. It was really a very rich, thought-provoking, at the same time, survey of mental illness in Eastern Europe. But also it was great to look at the sources and to compare the Jewish and Christian responses to mental illness. So thank you so much. There are already questions in the chat, but please ask more or raise your hands. There are many questions. It's great. So the first one was asked when you talked about the Krittler. Phyllis Homan Weisbart is asking, why did they not use the word Meshugenev, or did they use it?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Phyllis. And I must say that I've talked on this topic a few times already, and I haven't had that question yet, which is a great one. And the answer is that I actually don't know. I don't know why they did not more often use either the Hebrew term Meshuga or the Yiddish term. It may be because they might have been deliberately been using archaisms in their Hebrew because of the tone that they felt they needed to take in in these petitions to this great rabbi. It might be that Meshuga was kind of just too common a word, whereas the other terms that I explained to you, or the other terms that you saw in those examples that I gave, were, I would say, much more formal in a way. But it's a question that I don't have an easy answer to, that I would need to look into a little bit more, because obviously at the time in conversational Yiddish, meshuge would have been a pretty common term to use for either as for someone who is really mentally ill, or if you want to insult someone. So yeah, I'm not really sure about that. Maybe because it did have those overtones of insult. Maybe that's why they refrained from using the term.
Thank you. Anne Summers is asking, was there any perception that interbreeding in small communities was responsible for the Down syndrome or other conditions?
So that's a good question about genetic conditions that might have been caused by too small a genetic pool. This was raised at the time. It was usually raised by non-Jewish critics of Jews, usually anti-Semites, who sometimes tried to draw upon the existing genetic science of the day to explain why it was that Jews were the way they were. And they would sometimes say that because Jews had too small a gene pool, this is why they had so many people with defects, which is what they would have called it at the time. I mean, we know today, of course, we have scientific evidence that there are genetic diseases that exist specifically among Ashkenazic Jews that are a result of a relatively small gene pool. I mean, not tiny, but a relatively small genetic pool over centuries. But at the time, I don't remember specifically any Jewish experts within the Jewish community talking about the genetic issue being a specific problem. Usually they talked about the environmental issues, right? The environmental causes of Jewish neurosis. They talked about persecution. They talked about the poverty and all these other issues that Jews have had to deal with. But it was something that was definitely voiced as a possibility at the time.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Henry, you are next. Do you want to ask your question yourself? Henry Greenspan.
Yeah, I'll do it live. Whoops.
Great.
I'll try. Yeah, hi. I was interested in whether there was any sense of the town fools as sort of court jesters, including at least an inchoate sort of social critique in their jesting. I'm working on a play about, as many have, of Rubinstein, Mad Jester of the Warsaw Ghetto, a very well-known person, who clearly included in his antics and so on social commentary, very importantly so. But I'm wondering if that was a tradition in some of the town fools earlier.
Yes, thank you for asking that. And that sounds like a fantastic project. And the answer is absolutely yes. I didn't talk about this because of time, but for example, one of the quote unquote town fools who I was talking about, who was active in Vilna, who lived in the Vilna, the center of the Jewish religious neighborhood, the Schulhof, it was called. I was searching for the name. The Schulhof was the synagogue courtyard in front of the great synagogue of Vilna. He was described as giving perorations against the establishment of the Jewish community, as giving these sermons, which people listened to because they were amusing, but I think they also hit home in some ways. And if I remember correctly, there's some other examples as well of these folks talking about the great and good of the local Jewish community in ways that nobody else dared to. So there was a certain kind of outlet that these people represented. Yeah, for sure. And if you contact me offline, I can try to send you some of those references.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I'm muted. Yeah, thank you very much. I'll continue with the question in the chat. Max Monday is asking, was the mental illness as a Jewish issue used by Zionists to argue for immigration to Palestine? If not, do we know what other solutions were offered? Thinking about the way that Max Nordau and others said that Jewish corporal reality had suffered chronic degeneration through living in ghettos, and a muscle Jew could replace this in Palestine. Thank you for a fascinating lecture.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Max, for bringing that up. Another piece of the puzzle that I didn't have time to get to, but I'm glad that you mentioned it, because there was this concern, especially among Zionists, about Jewish degeneracy. Of course, this was also a concern of anti-Semites. So there's kind of two sides to this coin, right? Then the Zionist side was that Jews had, because of the long centuries in the diaspora and the concentration of Jews in cities and in certain economic spheres, had caused them to cause certain aspects of their character, we might say, to atrophy. And that one possible symptom of this was the apparent growth in Jewish neurosis. So yes, Zionists did point to this. And they did more generally, and I discussed this in my book, they more generally use the symbol or the icon of the Jewish outcast, whether it's the beggar or the orphan or sometimes the mentally ill person, as a kind of symbol for the entire suffering Jewish diaspora in exile. And obviously use that as part of their argument for why Jews needed to undergo this renaissance that Zionism would help bring about by bringing Jews back to the land and having them work the land, live in more normal economic and sociological circumstances.
Very good. Mike and Barbara Cooper are asking, I'm curious about the juxtaposition in Dr. Wieser's organization of the indigent with the nervous and mentally ill. That seems either a very broad canvas of social concern or some sort of close link amongst those states. Yet in many Jewish communities, I imagine that a great proportion of people could probably have been labeled as being indigent in some way and to some degree. Can you comment?
Yes, yes, absolutely. So generally, if Jewish families were comfortable, prosperous, they could usually care for a mentally ill person themselves. The problem became if you were too poor to care for that person because you had to go out and work all day, and either you didn't have room for the person or you were worried about how much attention they required. And it's true that many, as I mentioned, many Jews were poor. There were different levels of poverty, of course, right? Not everyone was indigent, and not everyone was destitute. And the people that I tend to talk about in the book, because these states of being out, these different states of outcastness, to coin a awkward word, tend to overlap. So disabled people tend to be poor in the Jewish community, as is true for any community in the world that we're talking about here, and to some extent in our world too, because they often don't have ways of supporting themselves. If they don't have access to family support, then they often have to beg, right? And so that was often the case in Eastern Europe as well. And I described the scenes that newspapers were writing about, which were these, at least according to these accounts, large groups of mentally ill people who were essentially wandering the streets of the city. There obviously may be some exaggeration there, but I think there's a kernel of truth in there as well. And so, yeah, there was a lot of overlap between these different states of being an outcast in the Jewish community. And Wiesel's concern was mostly for people who were mentally ill and also had no way to care for themselves, and therefore were essentially, it fell to the Jewish community to care for them, because at the time of the establishment of this institution, there really was no effective state care for the mentally ill in the Russian Empire, and Poland was part of the Russian Empire at this point, so that you had to wait until the 1920s for there to be the beginnings of any kind of welfare state that we would be familiar with today. But even then, it didn't tend to care much for Jews. So Jews were pretty much on their own.
And I think next, Tony. Thank you for your patience, Tony.
Thanks very much, Natan, for a great paper, and it's great to have you back again. Yeah, my question sort of relates to the question before, in the sense of, do we have any meaningful statistics to see if Jews were more prone to mental illness? I mean, I sort of thinking of statistics for minorities in Britain today, where you've got even for sort of second generation, spectacularly higher mental illness amongst those of colour, particularly because of discrimination and everyday hostility, and whether it's at all possible to sort of compare sort of numbers that are in institutions or just anything else that might give us a sense of whether it was a higher proportion or not.
Yeah, that's a great question, Tony. Part of my own challenge with in coming to an answer to that question, which I tried to do in the book, was that the statistics were so often used by one side or another as a kind of propaganda tool or a cudgel in some way. So, you know, you'd have Jewish experts who are arguing that yes, there are higher rates of mental illness among Jews, and the statistics from the time in Poland seem to support that, but it might be, well, it's only those who are institutionalized, right? Well, we don't, but that doesn't include people who are not institutionalized. So is it a representative sample or not? Or is it just that Jews are more likely to put their mentally ill folks into a hospital as opposed to Christians at the time who might be less trustful of medical authorities? So that, and you might have the other side arguing, by the other side, I mean the side that's saying Jewish mental illness is no more widespread. I mean, mental illness is no more widespread among Jews than among any other group, and they could point to their statistics as well. I was not able to, and I discussed this a little bit in the book, but I wasn't really able to come to a conclusion one way or the other. And it still feels, I mean, you brought up the question of minorities in Britain today, and it's kind of a hot potato, right? I mean, because even today, if I give this talk, let's say in a Jewish community, there are people who get their hackles up and who say, wait a second, they're saying that Jews are more likely to be crazy than other people, and it ties into all of these stereotypes, like the neurotic Jewish man that still exists today, and you can see in Woody Allen films and other aspects of popular culture. So, I mean, the answer is that I don't really have a good answer, but there seem to be statistics that suggest that maybe it was true, and it's what you're saying now about contemporary Britain is I hadn't been aware of that, and it's really interesting to me because it also says to me, and I suppose I have a certain investment in this too. It says to me, well, maybe it's okay for a historian to say that there was a higher rate of mental illness among Jews. Maybe it's not defamatory to say something like that, which some people, might perceive it as. So it's a kind of a sensitive topic, but I'm glad that you mentioned that. And if offline, I'm going to ask you for some more, for sources about the data that you're mentioning, which I think is really very relevant.
Thank you very much. Mark Cornwall, another colleague from Parks in the History Department.
Hello. Yes, thank you very much, Natan. Really, really wonderful research. I'm interested, I mean, this might be a rather enormous question. I'm interested in how mental illness was defined, and I'm really interested in how you actually went about thinking about the parameters of who would be in this category. Because to start with, I was thinking that the research was very much about people with really obvious severe mental illness, and you could spot it a mile off. And then we went to the kind of the village idiot, which might just be kind of some local eccentric, really. So I wondered how you kind of worked out how you would define this, or were you just really basing your definition on how experts saw this? But clearly you were also thinking about how locals saw this, which might be almost anyone who was rather abnormal in the community. So I wonder how so the book, I'll have to go and read the book, obviously, but how far the book, how you coped with that. Yeah, thank you.
Right, thanks for that question. That's a very good question. Kind of goes to the heart of the methodology here. And I think it's safe to say that, or at least I feel that I'm safe saying it, somebody else might not, but I tended to go with the perception of the historical actors that I was writing about. So if their perception was that the person had a different mental state from the norm at the time, then I included them. And I grant what you're suggesting about the question of the town fool or the village idiot, which is that we don't know in all cases exactly what their mental state was. Sometimes it was really just an eccentric, and sometimes there seems to have been some kind of cognitive disability, and sometimes you can't tell, right? Sometimes the line is quite blurry. And that was definitely a frustration and a challenge about doing this project, because the people's states of mind are described in ways that don't always map onto our current understanding and our current definitions and diagnoses. So, for example, when I was talking about those petitions, and I was sharing with you all sometimes my frustration in understanding what's actually going on with this particular person. And it's not something that I think can really ever be solved. That, for example, that boy who was described as being rebellious, there's no real evidence that he was what we would describe as mentally ill. But some of the language suggested that at the time there was a perception that he was somehow that he was different and to be understood differently than usual. So I don't know if that's a very satisfactory answer to your question, but ultimately, yeah, I tried to take it on a case-by-case basis and not generally to try to apply our contemporary definitions or diagnoses, which admittedly ends up with an account that that is not always cut and dry.
Yeah, thank you, Natan. And yeah, I agree that you have a very strong and robust methodological approach and ethical approach, because of course all the vocabulary, as you said during your talk, using words that are not acceptable nowadays. But I think that, yeah, as you show in your book, it's very important to actually keep the thinking and the categories used at the time. Well, anyway, Dana, next question, please.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I apologize if I'm asking about something that you have covered because I arrived a little bit late. I'm an anthropology, cultural and linguistic anthropology PhD student, and I'm an oral history Master of Arts student. And I currently am working on a project with the NIH on disabled women's reproductive lives. And so there's a couple of comments and questions. One of my comments was that there's this issue throughout. Historically, I also worked at Ellis Island with oral histories, and you found that it's the appearance of normalcy that matters. So invisible disabilities, or non-apparent as they're called in certain circles, basically was what it was about, and masking that for an appearance in order to go through. In fact, certain people would buy tickets in second class just to get less scrutiny visibly. They were concerned about medical, issues physically, illness-wise, but regardless, people went out of their way in different creative ways. We've learned from the oral histories to mask whatever that disability might have been. And what I was wondering though is that these categories, right? I find that even in my research now, categories can strain and impose limits on what can be learned from the person's experience. I know that you're working historically in a very different time period where there are no sort of narratives of these individuals for themselves. But I guess what I was wondering is, in disability studies more broadly, there's this movement not to stigmatize and to sort of say neurodivergent instead of whatever that diagnosis with the stigmatization has. And I guess I was just wondering how you kind of straddled those two worlds of, with the ADA and with sort of disability empowerment and inclusion, and contemporary Jewish community takes on that with the history as well as the sort of stigmatized throughout, across the board way that things are talked about, represented, and referred to. I just find that challenging. So I would love to hear what you think. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that question. And your work sounds fascinating. And I'm glad that you're involved in that. You raise a really, really important challenge. And that's part of the reason why, although I've considered bringing my research to the Jewish disability community in the United States at various points, I felt really ambivalent about it because it's a hard history to bring, and there's not a whole lot of bright points here. I mean, there are a few. There's a beautiful story in one of the memorial books about a a boy with some sort of developmental disability who was mercilessly teased by the boys in the town, but he was also taken under the wing of a Torah teacher who ended up giving him and training him for his bar mitzvah. It's a beautiful story, and it's a story that has parallel in today's world. So, and then Dr. Wiesel, who I mentioned as well, is also a heroic figure. So I think it's important to try to bring out those bright points and to talk about them. But yeah, I mean, it's a struggle because, you know, it's funny. One of the descriptions that I sometimes use for this talk that I gave today includes the term neurodiverse. You know, like we know today that Jews are no more or no less neuro. Actually, what I said was in relationship to Tony's question before, what I tend to say is the Jews of Eastern Europe are no more or less neurodiverse than any other group. Well, I think that's true. But I try to signal there that, you know, I'm trying to approach this from a different angle altogether. But the newer approach that you're talking about is really still so new. I mean, it's just a matter of a few years that we're appreciating more, you know, and I know from personal experience here at my own university, you know, trying to integrate people who have different learning abilities, different learning approaches, rather than stigmatizing them. But stigma is still a huge part of the story. And I think part of the responsibility of historians of disability is to tell that story like it is, so that folks who are interested in it today can understand the toll of stigma. And of course, look, it's still happening in so many different ways, right? I mean, even in the ultra-Orthodox community in the United States or in Israel, any kind of developmental or cognitive disability is, I mean, or any disability at all is still a huge concern because of marriage prospects, right? That's really what people are worried about. And if word gets out, you were talking about trying to hide it in some way, and people do that because if word gets out, then that particular daughter or son, their prospects are going to go down. They're going to have to be married only to someone who's also considered second rate in some way. And it continues to be a very painful, you know, a painful picture. So I think, I mean, I'm not working currently so much on history of disability, but I'm grateful that the project gave me some angle into that developing world, and I'm still a member of I'm actually really, I'm not saying this to I mean, it's going to sound silly. I'm not saying this to show off. I was just really, really pleased and delighted that this book won an award from the Society for Disability History, because I wanted it to get some recognition in the world of disability studies. And although as I mentioned, I'm not really a disability historian myself, I was gratified to know that the little bit that I did in the book meant something to people who have dedicated their work to disability history. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up.
Basically, you just replied to the question by Phyllis Solman Weisbart, who said, wouldn't some Jewish families have kept their mentally ill at home and hidden so as not to jeopardize marriage prospects for the others? Do you want to add anything? No. Any more questions? Maybe I can ask a question. I would like to hear more about how modern intellectuals, modern writers, and maybe modern artists. I was thinking actually a lot of Chagall paintings when you were, well, it's maybe more about the physical disabilities, but you know, his first paintings of fiddlers, clearly you had these blind musicians, and they have become, of course, the emblem of Jews in Eastern Europe. And there are lots of interpretation about this, why his fiddlers are blind, and is it a way of showing a particular connection to, I don't know, creativity, freedom, Yeah. So I wonder if you could say a bit more about how these disabilities were represented in modern Yiddish literature or Hebrew literature, and what did they represent or what did they mean for these new intellectuals, nationalist or Yiddish intellectuals?
Thanks for asking that question, Claire, because it is an important part of the book that another part that I didn't get to talk about in my formal talk, but I do spend a good amount of energy looking at literature. And it's not something that I had done much of before, and it was actually very exciting to me to enter into that new world, which has become much more a part of my research than it had been. And in particular, in terms of mental illness, I look at some of the works of Peretz, of the great Yiddish writer Y.L. Peretz, who was active in the late 19th and the very early years of the 20th century. And he does have a few important works that are dedicated to the theme of mental illness. And I mean, he's a great writer, just on the world stage. And so the way he explores it is so rich and so multifaceted. Usually when disability was explored in Jewish literature at the time, especially if we're thinking of the Yiddish stage, the Yiddish theater, which is a very important part of Jewish life at the time, or of let's say the feuilletons that were published in Jewish newspapers, it tended to be kind of crudely symbolic, right? I mean, you have the blind person standing in for, it's kind of symbolic of someone who is metaphorically blind, right? Can't perceive some very important elements of life, and sometimes even just for comic effect, really. You have that as well. The ubiquitous cripple or the ubiquitous madman on the stage. But in the case of Peretz, there's a much more searching exploration of the theme of mental illness. And really, it's a way of trying to understand, I think it's a way of trying to understand the human condition, which is what you would, I think, how mental illness is often used in great literature. I think today, if we were to find it in a literary work, I think contemporary authors would be much more conscious of their responsibility towards the neurodiverse community and responsibility in understanding that world and representing it in a responsible way, in an ethical way. That wasn't the concern so much at the time, of course. And so they're able to use, maybe one would say, take advantage of the condition of madness to explore some really, really pressing themes for them about, what kind of world do we live in? Is it a world that is really entirely mad anyway? Is any of us actually quote unquote sane? Those are the kinds of things that Peretz brings up in his own oeuvre. And in Hebrew literature, I looked at some different works, but primarily at Agnon, the Nobel Prize winner, the Nobel Prize novelist, who started out life in Eastern Europe and ended up in Israel later on. But he also wrote some important works that dealt with disability, that dealt with the concept or the phenomenon of the hekdesh, the Jewish poorhouse. And there as well, because he's a great artist, these are not crude portraits. They're very nuanced. They're very sensitive. There's a very important short story that he wrote relatively early in his career, about a man with a physical disability in a small town in Eastern Europe, and how he's treated by the Jewish community. And it's really sympathetic portrait to him. And it also there's a certain Zionist tinge to it as well, because the people who treat him, the people who treat him in the hospital, and who are most sensitive to his condition as a human, they are progressives. They are nationalists. They are kind of looking towards the Zionist ideal rather than the more backward world of traditional Eastern Europe, which is often how you see that world portrayed in the literature of the day, whether it's in Hebrew or in Yiddish. You often have that slant where because the writers themselves were generally secular, they were generally progressive, and so they tended to portray the backward, traditionalist, pious Jewish Eastern Europe as being being insensitive and exploitative even of disabled people, whereas those who are those who are portrayed as the heroes tend to be those who are on the kind of the side of history, which in their case would be the side of the nationalist movements, either Zionism or secularism or some kind of progressivism as well. And there were actually some Yiddish films at the time that also reflect that same kind of approach. People who are interested should take a look at a Yiddish film called The Light Ahead. The Light Ahead, which is called, in Yiddish, it's called Fischke der Krummer. You might even have it in the Parks Library. It's possible. But
I think.
You do? Okay, I'll type it in the chat. Fischke
der Krummer, yeah.
Der Krummer, yeah, based on a novella by the famous Yiddish writer Mendele Mocher Sfarim, and that portrays I'll say it in the way that it would have been said at the time, a crippled young man with his blind girlfriend, and the way that they're horribly treated by the Jewish community, but ultimately they achieve redemption by fleeing Eastern Europe, by getting the hell out of there and finding a place that's much more forward-looking and much more welcoming.
Thank you so much, Natan. I think we don't have time for the last question from Mark, and we will finish on literature. I like that. So really many thanks for so many insights, a wonderful lecture. Thank you to all the audience members who asked such great questions and for your very sharp answers. I will just announce the next 2 research seminars. So tomorrow we have a seminar with James Jordan about rethinking the BBC archives, a research conversation about Jewish culture and post-colonial literatures in the British media. And in 2 weeks' time, we will have a discussion with a musicologist and reflections on anti-racist musicology from a Jewish scholar. Have a wonderful evening, everybody. Thank you for joining.
Thank you, everyone. It was great to see you all.